Ruth Calder stepped off the freight wagon at Split Creek with a carpet bag in one hand and a tin box of her mother's spice recipes in the other, and the first thing she noticed was that nobody came out to meet her. The yard was wide and hard-packed, ringed by a low bunkhouse and a barn that leaned very slightly to the east, and a dozen chickens scattered when the wagon wheels groaned to a stop. She stood there a moment in the thin October light, letting her eyes adjust, and then she picked up her bag and started walking toward the house, because waiting had never gotten her anywhere. The rancher came around the side of the barn before she reached the porch. He was a big man, though not tall so much as built wide through the shoulders. With a beard he clearly trimmed himself and badly, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He looked at her the way a man looks at a bill he wasn't expecting. He didn't say hello. He said, "You're late." The road was washed out past Carver's Crossing, Ruth said. "I came as soon as it cleared." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the plain gray dress, the bag, the tin box she held against her ribs like it mattered more than anything else she carried. "You're the cook the agency sent." "I am. Last one lasted 4 days." He said it flatly, not as a warning exactly, just a fact he wanted on the table. "Hands here are particular." "I've fed particular men before," Ruth said, and walked past him toward the cookhouse door, because she'd learned a long time ago that the way you answered a test like that was by not treating it like one at all. His name was Silas Boone, and in the 4 days it took her to learn the rhythms of his kitchen, he said perhaps 30 words to her total. He was not unkind, he was simply a man who had run out of reasons to talk, the kind of quiet that settles into a person after enough disappointment. Ruth recognized it because she had worn that same silence herself, the 2 years since her husband Daniel died of a fever on a Nebraska claim that never once turned a decent crop. The foreman was a different matter. Ezra Klein had been at Split Creek 11 years, since before Silas owned it outright, and he made his opinion of the new cook known within the first hour by asking her, in front of 4 other men, whether she knew the difference between a skillet and a wash basin. The men laughed. Ruth set down the flour sack she was carrying, looked at him evenly, and said she supposed she'd find out at supper. Ezra didn't laugh at that. He watched her walk back into the cookhouse with the particular stillness of a man recalculating something. The cookhouse itself told her most of what she needed to know about the last 4 years of Split Creek. The stove was sound, but the flue drew poorly. The pantry held salt pork gone gray at the edges, and flour with weevils working through the bottom of the sack. Someone had tried, at some point, to keep order in the place, stacking tins by size instead of by use. But the effort had the look of a task begun and then abandoned halfway. The way things get abandoned in a house where the person who used to care about such things is gone. She asked Tobin, the youngest hand, about it while he hauled water for her that first evening, and he told her plainly that Mrs. Boone had passed 3 winters back, and that nothing in the kitchen had been quite right since. Ruth did not comment on that. She simply started fixing what could be fixed. She scrubbed the flue herself, standing on an overturned crate with a rag wrapped around a broom handle, and had the stove drawing clean by the second morning. She sorted the pantry by what needed using first and what could keep, threw out what couldn't be saved, and wrote a short supply list for the next town run that Silas read without comment and filled without complaint. She made biscuits from a starter she'd carried 400 miles in a stoneware crock wrapped in wool, and when Cole Whitfield, the oldest hand on the payroll, ate 3 of them without a word, and then quietly asked if there were more, she understood that the real evaluation had already begun, and that it would be conducted entirely at the supper table. The first weeks were not easy. 22 men ate at Split Creek during the fall gather, counting the extra hands Silas brought in for the roundup, and feeding them well on a working ranch's budget required the kind of arithmetic Ruth had learned the hard way, first on her father's farm in Missouri, and later during the 2 seasons she'd cooked for a railroad survey crew before she married Daniel. She stretched what she had. She used the whole animal when a steer was slaughtered for the crew, not just the good cuts, rendering the fat, curing what could be cured, turning bones into broth that lasted a week. She learned which men liked their coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, and which preferred it gentler, and she remembered without being told, because remembering was its own kind of respect, and she understood that a cook who paid attention earned trust faster than one who apologized. Ezra Klein remained unconvinced for longer than the others. He was not cruel about it, not exactly, but he had a way of finding fault that felt deliberate, commenting on a slightly dry biscuit while ignoring 3 good meals in a row, asking her once in front of the whole table whether the agency had told her Split Creek was a working outfit and not some boarding house for city women. Silas, at the head of the table, said nothing in those moments, which Ruth noticed and filed away without deciding yet what it meant. She answered Ezra the same way each time, without heat, without apology, and went back to her work, because she had learned that a woman who defended herself too loudly in a room full of men usually ended up defending herself for the rest of her life, and she had no intention of doing that again. The sharpest of it came on a Sunday, when a neighboring rancher named Prescott rode in to talk business with Silas and stayed for the noon meal. Prescott looked Ruth over the same way Ezra had that first hour, and remarked to the table at large that a working outfit ought to have a cook who could rope a steer if it came to that, not a woman who looked as though a hard wind would carry her off. Ezra laughed at that, the loudest Ruth had heard him laugh since she'd arrived, and for a moment the old doubt closed back over the table like weather rolling in. Ruth set down the platter of cornbread she'd been carrying, met Prescott's eye without heat, and said that she'd once fed a survey crew of 40 men through a Missouri winter on half the supplies Split Creek kept in its pantry, and that she supposed a hard wind hadn't caught up with her yet. Cole Whitfield, who rarely offered an opinion on anything that didn't concern livestock, said mildly that Prescott's own cook had quit twice that year, and the table's laughter turned before Prescott had time to decide whether he minded it. What she did not know, because nobody had told her, was that Ezra Klein had lost his own wife to consumption 6 years earlier, and that watching another woman move through a kitchen his late wife had once kept had cost him something he wasn't prepared to name out loud. Cole Whitfield told her that much one evening while she scrubbed pots after supper, offering it the way old men sometimes offer information they think a person ought to have, quietly and without much ceremony. Ruth turned it over in her mind and decided it explained something without excusing it, and she went on with her scrubbing. It didn't make Ezra's remarks easier to hear the next time he made one, but it made them easier to answer without bitterness, and bitterness, she had learned over 2 long years of widowhood, cost more in the end than it ever paid back. She settled into a rhythm those first weeks that felt, more than anything, like the shape of her own hands finally fitting a place again. Mornings began before the sun, coffee on and biscuits in the oven. By the time the men stirred, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread drifting out across a yard still silvered with frost. She learned the ranch's particular economy the way she'd once learned Daniel's, by watching where the money was thin and where it could bear weight, stretching a side of bacon 2 days further than the last cook had managed, putting up jars of chokecherry preserves from the thicket along the creek before the birds could strip it bare. She wrote letters some evenings, brief ones, to her sister back in Missouri, and did not mention Ezra's cool remarks or Prescott's rudeness in them, because there seemed no purpose in troubling anyone with weather that was already passing. The second week brought the first real test, though nobody called it that at the time. A gully washer came through in the night and took out a stretch of fence along the north pasture, and half the herd scattered into the breaks before dawn. Silas had every able hand out from before first light, riding hard in cold rain to gather cattle that didn't want to be gathered, and by the time they straggled back near dusk, soaked through and shaking with cold, Ruth had a kettle of beef and barley stew going that had been simmering since noon on nothing but instinct and the certainty that a day like that would end exactly the way it did. She had coffee ready, strong, and bread still warm from the oven, and she had moved the long table closer to the stove so the men could eat within reach of the heat. Nobody said much when they came in. They were too cold and too tired for speeches. But Tobin, who was 19 and had never learned to hide what he was thinking, said around a mouthful of bread that it was the best thing he'd eaten since his mother's kitchen back in Ohio, and Cole Whitfield nodded slowly at that in a way that passed, among men like these, for a standing ovation. Ezra Klein ate 2 full bowls and didn't say a single critical word, which was, from him, close to an apology. Silas came in last, after seeing to the horses himself instead of leaving it to Tobin the way he usually did. He sat at the head of the table with rain still dripping from his hat brim and looked at the spread in front of him for a moment before he picked up his spoon. He didn't thank her out loud, but Ruth caught him glancing toward the cookhouse doorway twice more before the meal was through. The way a man looks at something he's still deciding whether he's allowed to want. Later that night, long after the men had turned in, Ruth found the kettle still simmering low and ladled out a bowl for herself, sitting alone at the long table with the lamp turned down to save the oil. She thought of the Nebraska winters she'd survived on considerably less than Split Creek kept in its pantry, and of Daniel's voice telling her once, before the fever took him, that she had a gift for making a hard day feel survivable simply by feeding the people caught inside it. She hadn't believed him fully at the time. She was beginning to. The next test came without warning, the way the hardest ones usually do. Tobin took a fall from a green colt he had no business riding alone, and came in white-faced and favoring his left side, trying his best to walk it off in front of the older hands the way boys of 19 generally do. Ruth took one look at him crossing the yard and did not wait for anyone's permission. She sat him down at the kitchen table, cut away his shirt where it had torn, and found a gash along his ribs deep enough to need stitching, and a bruise already spreading dark and wide beneath it. She had learned to stitch a wound on the Nebraska claim, out of necessity rather than training, the nearest doctor being 11 miles off, and unreliable even when the roads were clear, and her hands did not shake while she worked, though Tobin's did. Silas came in halfway through and stood in the doorway without speaking, watching her thread the needle a second time and talk Tobin through the pain in a low, even voice that had nothing performed about it. She kept the boy in the room off the kitchen for 4 days after that, feeding him broth and checking the stitches morning and night, and refused to let him back on a horse until she was satisfied the wound wouldn't tear open again. Ezra Klein came by twice during those 4 days to sit with the boy for an hour and say nothing much of anything. And on the second visit he stopped in the kitchen doorway on his way out and told Ruth, without quite meeting her eyes, that his late wife Sarah had kept a needle and thread in her apron pocket every day of their marriage, the way some women carried a Bible, and that he hadn't seen anybody handle a wound with that particular calm since she'd passed. It wasn't an apology, not in so many words, but Ruth understood it as the closest thing to one Ezra Klein was likely to offer, and she accepted it in the same spirit it was given, without making more of it than it was. By the time Tobin was back on his feet, something in the household had shifted again. Quieter this time than the night of the storm, but no less real. The men had stopped testing her and started simply expecting her, which was its own kind of honor on a ranch like Split Creek, where nothing was given easily and nothing was said twice if it didn't need saying. Even Prescott, riding through again on ranch business a week later, ate his meal without comment and left without remark, which from a man like that amounted to a full retraction. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By the 3rd week, the kitchen at Split Creek had become something it hadn't been in 3 years, which was the actual center of the ranch, rather than a room men passed through on their way somewhere else. Hands lingered over coffee after supper instead of scattering straight to the bunkhouse. Tobin took to sitting near the stove with a whittling knife and a scrap of pine, working slow and aimless, while Ruth finished the dishes, talking about nothing in particular, the kind of talk a boy makes when he's decided a place is safe enough to be himself in. Cole Whitfield started bringing her wild onions and mushrooms he found while riding fence, setting them on the cutting board without comment, which Ruth understood as its own quiet language. Silas remained the hardest to read. He was a careful man, precise in the way he spoke on the rare occasions he spoke at all, and Ruth came to understand that his silence wasn't coldness so much as economy, a habit built by 3 years of running a ranch and raising nobody, grieving nobody's questions, answering to nobody's supper table but his own. She learned, through Cole, that his wife Ann had died in childbirth, along with the baby, and that Silas had buried them both on a rise above the creek, where he could see the marker from the kitchen window if he chose to look, which by all accounts, he mostly didn't. She did not push him to talk about it. She had learned enough about grief of her own to know that it wasn't a door you knocked on for someone else. Instead, she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to keep the kitchen running well and to be steady in it, morning after morning, the kind of steadiness that doesn't announce itself but accumulates, the way trust generally does on a ranch, one competent day stacked on top of another until the pile is too tall to argue with. The turn came in the 4th week, when a man named Whitcomb rode in from the agency office in town, with a letter for Ruth and an offer that had nothing kind in it. The Drummond Ranch 2 valleys over had lost their cook to a lung complaint and was willing to pay $8 a month more than Split Creek could offer, and the agency, being in the business of filling positions rather than keeping promises, had sent Whitcomb out to collect her if she was willing to go. He delivered this in the yard, in front of Silas and Ezra and half the crew, with the easy confidence of a man used to women moving wherever the better wage told them to. "It's a fair offer," Whitcomb said, looking Ruth over the way he might size up a horse for sale. "Better outfit, better pay, closer to town. No reason for a woman in your position to turn it down." Ruth felt the yard go quiet around her, the particular quiet of men waiting to see which way a thing was going to break. She thought of the $8, which mattered, because $8 was real money, and she had learned the hard way what happened to women who let pride outrun arithmetic. But she thought also of the flue she'd scrubbed clean with her own hands, and Tobin's pine shavings scattered by the stove, and Cole's wild onions on the cutting board, and the way the kitchen at Split Creek had slowly, unglamorously, become a place worth being in. "I'll think on it," she told Whitcomb, which was true, because she believed in thinking things through rather than answering from her temper. It was Silas who spoke next, and it was the most words Ruth had heard him say at one time since she arrived. "She's not obligated to answer you today," he said, stepping forward from where he'd been standing near the barn. His voice was even, but there was something under it that hadn't been there in any conversation Ruth had witnessed since her first afternoon at Split Creek. "And she's not obligated to answer you at all, if she'd rather not." Whitcomb looked between them, reading something in the air that made him considerably less certain of his errand than he'd been riding in. "The Drummond outfit is waiting on an answer by week's end." "Then they'll have their answer by week's end," Silas said. "Same as anyone." Whitcomb left without pressing further, which men in his position generally knew how to do once the ground had shifted under them. The yard did not go back to its ordinary business right away. Ezra Klein, who Ruth had spent a month believing thought little of her, was the one who broke the silence, saying to no one in particular that the Drummond outfit wouldn't know a good cook from a fry pan, and that Split Creek had gone 3 years without decent bread and wasn't about to start losing it again over $8. Cole Whitfield nodded at that with the same slow certainty he'd shown the night of the storm. Ruth went back into the kitchen and finished the bread she'd left rising, because the bread did not care about offers from Drummond Ranches, and the work did not stop simply because something important had almost happened in the yard. Silas found her there an hour later, after the crew had scattered back to their evening chores. He stood in the doorway the way he often did, one shoulder against the frame, hat in his hand instead of on his head, which she had come to understand meant he had something on his mind he intended to say all the way through. "You should take the offer if it's the better wage," he said. "I won't hold it against you." Ruth kept her hands moving in the dough. "That's not why I'm still deciding." "Then why?" She looked up at him. In 4 weeks she had learned the particular quality of his silences, the ones that meant he was thinking and the ones that meant he was hiding. And this one, standing in her doorway with his hat in both hands, was neither. It was the silence of a man working up to something. "Because $8 doesn't tell me anything about whether a place is worth staying in," she said. "And I've been paying closer attention to this one than you might think." He was quiet a long moment. Outside, the last of the daylight was going gray-gold over the barn roof, and somewhere near the corral, Tobin was singing something tuneless and off-key to the horses the way he did most evenings. "Anne used to say this kitchen was the only room in the house that ever felt finished," Silas said finally. "I let it go to seed after she was gone. Didn't seem to matter who cooked in it, so long as the men ate." He turned his hat once in his hands. "It matters now." "The kitchen, or who's in it?" "Both," he said, "though I expect you already knew which one I meant." Ruth set the dough aside and wiped her hands on her apron, giving herself the moment she needed before she answered. "I'm not looking for a rescue, Mr. Boone. I've had a husband and I buried him, and I built a life out of the wreckage of that on my own 2 feet. I don't need saving." "I'm not offering to save you," Silas said. "I'm offering because this ranch has been half a household for 3 years, and you're the first thing that's made it feel like the other half again." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter and steadier than she'd heard from him before. "I'm not asking you to stay on as hired help, Ruth. I've got no interest in matching Drummond's wage and calling it settled. If you'll have me, I'm asking you to stay as my wife." The kitchen was very quiet. The bread dough sat forgotten on the board between them, and outside Tobin's tuneless singing carried faint across the yard, and Ruth stood with her hands still faintly dusted with flour and looked at a man who had said perhaps 200 words to her across 4 weeks, and had somehow, in this one moment, said the truest thing any man had said to her since Daniel died. "That's a great deal to ask a woman you've known a month," she said, though not unkindly. "It is," Silas agreed. I've thought about it longer than the month, though. I started thinking about it the night of the storm. Watching you keep this kitchen warm for 24 half-frozen men who'd have gone without if you hadn't been standing at that stove since noon, expecting exactly this kind of trouble. He met her eyes without flinching from them. I'm not a man who talks easy. I never will be. But I know what steady looks like when I see it, and I've been watching it walk through this kitchen for a month now. Ruth thought of Whitcomb and his $8, and of the Drummond Ranch 2 valleys over that would never know her name the way Split Creek already did. She thought of Cole's wild onions and Tobin's pine shavings and Ezra's grudging, hard-won respect, earned the only way respect worth having is ever earned. She thought of the flue she'd scrubbed clean and the pantry she'd set right and the marker on the rise above the creek that Silas mostly didn't look at, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes rarely and matters greatly when it does, that she was not being asked to give up a life she'd built. She was being asked to build the next one, here, with her hands already in the dough. Ask me again tomorrow, she said, after I've had a night to sit with it properly. But I expect you already know what I'll say. Something moved in Silas Boone's face that Ruth hadn't seen there before. Not quite a smile, but close kin to one. The expression of a man who had spent 3 years bracing for loss and had just, cautiously, allowed himself to stop. He set his hat back on his head, nodded once as though the matter were already half settled, and left her to finish her bread, though she noticed he lingered in the yard longer than his evening chores required, looking toward the kitchen window more than once before he finally turned in. He asked her again the next evening, in the same doorway, hat in hand, and this time Ruth answered him plainly, without needing the night to sit with it after all, because some answers only need saying out loud to become official, and hers had been settled since somewhere around the 3rd bowl of stew on the night of the storm. They married before the first snow, in the front room at Split Creek with Cole Whitfield and Tobin as witnesses, and Ezra Klein standing at the back with his hat over his heart, looking, for once, entirely without complaint. There was no grand ceremony. There was a supper afterward, cooked by Ruth herself because she wouldn't have trusted the meal to anyone else. And the men ate at the long table by lamplight, and the kitchen that had sat half-finished for 3 years held all of them easily, warm and full and exactly the size a household is supposed to be. Cole raised his coffee cup at some point in the evening, in place of the wine none of them had, and said only that Split Creek had been waiting a long while for its kitchen to feel whole again, and that he for one didn't intend to take a single supper for granted from here on out. Tobin, red in the face from something that wasn't entirely the fire's heat, said he supposed he'd finally learned the difference between a skillet and a wash basin after all, which drew the loudest laugh of the night, Ezra's loudest included. Ruth thought sometimes, in the quiet hours before the men woke for chores, about the woman who'd kept this kitchen before her, and about the marker on the rise she could see now from the window if she chose to look, and she found she didn't mind looking. Grief and a good life had never struck her as opposites. They simply sat side by side at the same table, the way most true things did, and a person learned to set a place for both. By spring the flue drew clean, the pantry stayed stocked, and Split Creek had a reputation across 2 counties for the best table in the territory, though Ruth never much cared for reputation. What she cared about was smaller and steadier than that. The sound of Tobin's off-key singing drifting through the kitchen window, the wild onions Cole still brought her though she no longer needed convincing, Ezra's quiet nod each morning that had become, over the winter, something closer to warmth than either of them would have admitted out loud, and Silas, who still didn't talk easy and never would, reaching for her hand across the table each evening as though he still couldn't quite believe he was allowed to. She wrote to her sister in Missouri that spring, with news that felt strange to set down in ink, and stranger still to mean as plainly as she did, that she had married a rancher who said little and meant every word of it, that the kitchen she now kept was hers in a way no kitchen had ever quite belonged to her before, and that a woman could travel a long, hard road away from one life and still, somehow, walk straight into the middle of another one worth having. She sealed the letter, set it by the door for the next town run, and went back to the stove, because supper did not cook itself, and she had 22 men and a husband to feed. She had come to Split Creek to fill a position nobody expected her to hold longer than a month. She stayed because the kitchen needed her, and then because the man in the doorway needed her, and then, quietly and without any fanfare at all, because she needed it too, the whole imperfect, hard-won shape of it, in a way she hadn't let herself need anything since the winter she buried Daniel, and told herself she'd get by on her own from then on. She had gotten by. But getting by, she'd learned at Split Creek, was never quite the same thing as coming home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.